Hello, everyone. You're joining with Advocata Institute and Advocata Institute Studio. And if you're following our channel, you know that we are conducting discussions, conversations, and research on current policy issues. And definitely, electricity and solar is one of the main topics as we discuss now. And joining with me is Mr. Ashish Khanna, Director General of International Solar Alliance. Ashish, welcome to Advocata and thank you very much for joining the conversation.
Ayubawan, Vanakkam, Namaskar.
Namaste, Namaskar.
It's a pleasure, Dhananath, to be here. I'm delighted for this opportunity to join you.
Thank you. I mean, the designation is clear. It's that you are the Director General of International Solar Alliance, but I know there's a lot which was unsaid in this designation. The humble beginnings that you started and also the work that you have done in Egypt, in Sub-Saharan Africa and at the World Bank. First, for the benefit of our audience, why don't you share a little bit about your story and what the International Solar Alliance is about. But more than that, the work that you have done in multiple parts of the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I was born in a small western town of Uttar Pradesh, a small state of 220 million people. It's called Bijnor, and very humble backgrounds, probably, but it was all because of my parents' huge interest in giving us the best education, and the economy of India, as you know, really opened up. So I'm a product of what exposure and relentless pursuit of what your heart says can lead you to. I was in private sector in India for 7 years, and then I thought of something much more purposeful and meaningful. I did some assignments for World Bank, and I took a substantial pay cut in joining the World Bank because I thought it would be a great platform. I was very fortunate to lead the India Energy program of World Bank. And in between, I took another career break to do Mason Fellowship at Harvard Kennedy School. And then, unfortunately, after my father passed away, I went to Egypt for 5 years. And, life sometimes helps you being in the right place at the right time. I was leading a big macroeconomic reform program, like what Sri Lanka went through, on looking at exchange rate, tax laws, but also a lot of renewable energy, private sector investment, looking after Middle East, North Africa for about 5 years, and then in Washington, D.C., in World Bank, for 6 years looking after Sub-Saharan Africa, feeling every day energized and fortunate to make a difference to the lives of so many people on a difficult issue. And as and when I got the opportunity and got elected by International Solar Alliance Assembly last November, I'm very fortunate to have taken over as Director General in March this year, just 4 months back.
And this is an elected position, is it?
Well, it so happened this year that now, if you allow me to talk a little bit about International Solar Alliance. It was a treaty-based organization born out of Paris COP in 2015 with the idea of Honorable Prime Minister of India, Mr. Narendra Modi, who along with the French president believed the time was right for almost global South to lead an alternate development paradigm of what development, especially in the area of solar, should be. Today, as we stand, 10 years from now, we have 124 countries as members of this treaty-based organization. They have an annual assembly every October and November. And when the new Director General was to be elected, because it's substantially bigger, obviously a lot of other countries had also expressed an interest. And therefore, there was a form of an election last November in which I was very honored to be elected, and I took over in March. So it's probably one of the largest multilateral institutions out of Global South. And I think that's a space that I feel is very exciting because the world is ready for different models of development paradigms to be taken away.
Since you mentioned about that you had to take a significant pay cut when you were joining the World Bank from the private sector, if I may ask, which industry that you worked before you're joining the World Bank, or in like which sector?
So I was in consulting.
Right.
I was in Arthur Andersen and KPMG.
Right.
And PwC, and doing very well, almost a director. But something, if I may use this opportunity, when youngsters ask me, I said always go by the heart.
Right.
And if you follow your heart, you love your job, your career will be taken care of. So salary cuts sometimes, once a while, it's fine as long as you're following your heart.
Absolutely. And now coming back on the International Solar Alliance. So I think media reported the comments that you made at the event in Colombo. Probably for Sri Lankans, while we are near the equator and everyone is talking about solar energy and everything that we can do with solar, tell us a little bit about with the alliance when you become a partner country, what are they abide with, and like what are the benefits that they will get, or what is the how the structure works.
Sure. So we are a member-based country, and what we are right now really pushing hard, and that was the vision and strategy shared in the Colombo Regional Committee meeting, which I should mention that it is an Asia Pacific meeting of all the countries of Asia and Pacific, in which Sri Lanka was the vice president. So Sri Lanka was hosting 180 delegates from 30 countries, including ministers of 13 countries.
Right.
So I think it was quite a regional leadership that Sri Lanka showed. And our evolving vision is across 4 pillars. First of all, we do not want to duplicate what other concessional lending institutions like ADB and World Bank do, nor a lot of academic research focused institutions like IEA and IRENA, which publish reports. So we are trying to see what is really needed to now push the envelope, and we see 4 pillars. The first pillar is, why is private sector investment not investing enough in renewable energy? Even though world saw $2.2 trillion invested in renewable energy, much higher than fossil fuels, less than 15% of that was going to developing countries. And actually less than 2% of that was going to Africa, which needs it the most because, as you might know, the energy access is a crisis there of 600 million people. And the primary reason is that private sector still sees a lot of risk in investing in these developing countries. The private sector, in my experience, as I specialize in enabling private investment, is looking for long-term policy and regulatory clarity. So our first pillar is focusing on what kind of policies and regulatory environment in the context of each country is extremely important to attract private sector investment, both domestic but also international.
Just wanted to, if I may interrupt for a second, on that policy pillar. So, do you do research on the policy and whether the countries contribute to sort of a collective policy, or whether there's what are the components of this policy? Before you move to the second
Sure.
pillar, I would like to go a little bit in depth on the policy front, because this is, in my view, very important. Yes.
So it is a combination of both.
Right.
What you said, Dhananath. First is that in the context of country, like for example, Sri Lanka, if you're doing a new law or if there's a regulation, what is it that is preventing private sector investment? Are there any policy and regulatory aspects of the law? And sometimes it requires a clear vision and clarity. For example, if you look at neighboring India, the government provided a clear vision of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030.
Right.
And 10 years back, it looked like a dream. But India has already done almost half of it. And 110 gigawatts of solar in just 10 years with $150 billion of investment has come.
$150 billion.
How did it come? It came because of policy and regulatory clarity. In addition to an announcement, there were clear policies for supporting the private sector, for supporting sometimes local manufacturing, creation of an institution called Solar Energy Corporation of India as an intermediary to reduce the risk, provide some financing, a standard template for power purchase agreements so that it's not replicated everywhere, and a very transparent bidding process that is eventually moved to an auction and reverse auction mechanisms to give clarity. A lot of investments on transmission to make sure that whatever you produce is easily absorbed in the system. And if a distribution company needs support, there are some clear policy. So it's an ecosystem development backed by a strong policy and regulatory environment. So based on that experience and other experiences, we bring all of these advice and then go to the country's context and see what kind of assistance would really help.
Thank you very much for that detailed explanation. So that means when Sri Lanka is part of the Solar Alliance, that we will have the access, the best practices of other countries, how to do more investment friendly, predictable, private sector led policy environment. So then we can attract more and more investment to reach out to our renewable energy targets. Does it? Did I understood it right? I just want to make sure.
Sure. Well, that would be our endeavor.
Right.
This is something I will come to it about the country partnership framework. It will be a very important pillar. But definitely, Sri Lanka will have access to all these elements. For example, let me tell you, if you want to have a utility scale solar, this model in world over, whether it's Middle East, Egypt, India, other places, Vietnam, it's very clear. You clear public land where the land titles are unencumbered. You prepare the land for private sector to invest in. You create transmission evacuation arrangements by government, and then you bid it out with very clear templates and penalties asking people to come and invest within a stipulated time frame.
Right.
It's a very standard template, and that will be on offer to Sri Lanka. But if you allow me, let me complete
Yes,
the pillars.
that's the first pillar, the policy pillar. Let's move to the second pillar. What's
Yeah.
the second pillar?
But the first pillar is enabling private investment. One part of it is policy.
Policy.
The other element of it is catalytic finance. Sometimes private sector is not investing not because of real risk, but a perceived risk. And unfortunately, world is full of countries which have a very good track record of 98% payment and others, but still investors are demanding a huge risk premium. So we also have a global solar facility because we don't want to be a bank, as I mentioned before, but we can offer catalytic finance that gives risk mitigation, blended finance instruments for countries to invest. Allow me to give you an example.
Absolutely. I was about to ask, give me an example.
Correct.
How does this work?
Let's take an example of a very large country like Nigeria. For your viewers who might not know, Nigeria is almost 200 million people. Half of them, unfortunately, almost more than 90 million people do not even have energy access. Sri Lanka has done a great job of energy access where 97-98% people have energy access. So a large country with such oil and gas resources not having energy access is leading them to a big push on distributed renewable energy. That is, when you're far away areas, you have either small microgrids, mini grids, solar home systems, solar pumps as a way for electrification of households, but also hospitals and others to drive the economy. Now, imagine 90 million people, a majority of them, almost more than half of them going to get DRE. They wanted private sector to start coming and investing. So about 100 mini grids successfully working are going to go up to 10,000 in 5 years. So the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, their sovereign fund, decided, okay, this is an important national goal. Let's set up a 150 million equity fund to invest in DRE. But their board decided there's risk. This is sovereign money. What if we lose it? So they approached us. Are you willing to give us a small guarantee of first loss so that if we invest in a company, the first 10% of the loss you can bear? And this kind of financial innovation is really needed to push the people over the mountain. It's a little bit of a hump for private investment. So we are agreeing in principle to give them 10%, 15 million of first loss of equity. So our 15 million is going to galvanize $150 million of equity. But as you know, in a debt equity of 1:4, that means almost 3 times of the debt. That's 450 million. So 15 million money can galvanize $600 million of funds. That is what is importance of catalytic finance. So that I think is the first pillar.
Can I ask a fundamental question? So the first pillar is more about giving the investors confidence and the private sector
Absolutely.
investment. So the Sri Lanka's, I'll quickly try to pick your brain on the Sri Lanka's context. So we have been, now there's a conversation about unbundling the generation, distribution, and transmission. But also there was a conversation that, okay, a strategic asset like electricity, why cannot the government run it on its own? Do you have any examples what are the challenges of the government trying to do it, or any success stories, or what are your thoughts? Because people may think, okay, you are trying to support the private sector investment, but why cannot the government do it given the strategic interest? Do you have any case studies or thought process on that question before we move to the second pillar?
Sure. So I was actually part over 15 years of multiple countries looking at precisely that question. And there is actually some very good compendium of resources. We did a report called Rethinking Power Reforms, if it is titled. It will give you worldwide experience of last 30 years of grappling with this question.
This is under World Bank?
This is on the World Bank.
Okay.
What can be done by public? What can be done by private? And my understanding right now, and I must confess, I will have a much more structured discussion on this after a couple of months once a country partnership strategy is ready. Let me give you an example from an international side. The objective of what you want to achieve should be very clearly laid out. And that is definitely bringing down the cost of generation, making sure there are no shortages, and the industry and everyone has a very affordable and reliable energy as engines of jobs and growth. The answer for that may come slightly differently in different countries. But if you have a fiscal crisis and if you have a huge debt by GDP problem, it's going to be very difficult for government to actually lead it. If you had a huge current account surplus and a huge surplus situation, you had the world's best state-owned enterprises. Countries have done this under state-owned enterprises as well. So it's a function of enabling circumstances and questions. Do you have world-class corporate governance of state-owned enterprises? Do you have a great fiscal surplus with you, either on current account or others, to actually invest? If not, it's going to be very difficult to do a state-owned. That, I think, is the general answer.
Thank you very much. So I think we are clear on the first pillar. Shall we move to the second pillar?
Sure.
Yes.
The second pillar is, and this is my very deep experience, personal experience of working in 25 countries, eventually development has to be self-owned on a local context. And therefore, you must have people in each country who are able to grapple with difficult trade-offs, just as the one you just mentioned before, in your own context. And I feel what is unfortunately missing is that countries are dependent on people outside of their country to give them advice. And therefore, we want to develop local capability in countries to decide what's best for them. We do it by setting up, from the solar side only, solar technology application resource centers called STAR-C, which are nothing but centers of excellence in your country, where we don't do physical infrastructure. The country chooses a university, and then we help them on your context. What is it that you really need to become a world-class center of excellence? In countries which want to do a lot more decentralized renewable energy like solar pumps and others, you will maybe need a good labs and good standards. Some people will need a lot of training to have people maintain your assets, because there's a very big risk. You're importing a lot, 5-7 years down the line, they may actually not work. So you need to create an ecosystem of maintenance and all of that stuff. But then there's also youth and startups. They're going to get and push as disruptors on the new models. So this is something that we are going to be ready in 17 countries by end of this year. And we are glad to report that as part of Sri Lanka Country Partnership Framework, Sri Lanka will be a country in which we are exploring a STAR-C center in University of Moratawa. What form it will take, what will be the focus areas, will be a subject of next 6 months to 9 months.
Excellent.
Within the second pillar, before I complete, we are now realizing that what's going to happen in the energy sector over 10 years is the revolution on digitization. What you saw through Amazon of online retail may actually happen in energy. And it just happens because we are based in India, which is the digital superpower house of the world. We want to give that expertise to all the countries so that countries can have a digital leapfrogging and not wait to tell from some developed world or what the latest digitization is. So these centers of excellence, we hope to be connected to a central global capability center that will give state-of-the-art digital and AI solutions to manage your grids sitting out of Delhi. That's the second pillar.
Excellent. That's very interesting that you mentioned that the belief system is that it has to be locally owned and driven by their own will and they should understand, the local context should understand that this is much needed. But it's an interesting setup that you explain how we are going to set up that at the University of Moratuwa and the knowledge centers, and it connects to a global setup. So how does it? Can you explain a little bit more on how does it work? Like how are the resources being done? How is the know-how transfer takes place? Who are the resources who will basically take the lead in each center? What is like the monitoring system looks like? How do you assure that it's falling under the broad purview? Could you give a little bit of context on that as well? Because that sounds quite, I would say, cool and interesting at the same time.
Yeah. So, Dhananath, I think a lot of detail we'll be able to give once the business plan for Star C in Sri Lanka is ready. But let me explain to you on a broader concept.
Yeah.
We believe a lot of places start training, but unfortunately stops after few training and the institution dies down.
Absolutely. That's the reason that I asked that question.
Yeah,
Yes.
you see? So, and I've been a witness of that in many countries myself. First of all, you need to have the right leadership. I did research on what creates world class institutions, and one of the first things that came out is the quality of founding dean and leadership that is there for a reasonable amount of time. If you first have the right leadership of that center of excellence, we'll have to help create a business plan for financial and operational sustainability. That will have to involve private sector lens in terms of jobs, because training is only that relevant if it can lead to certain job and employment. So I think our focus is on having the right leadership and operational and financial sustainability of those centers, and then we connect them to all the other spokes as well as the hub. That's something that we will endeavor over next 6 months to 9 months.
Excellent. So we have covered two pillars so far. Shall we move to the
the
next
third.
pillar? Yes.
The third pillar is that the problem needs regional solutions. Each country should not be looking at solving all its problems, and therefore we will have certain regional platforms. One of them is on regional interconnections. And we believe island countries like Sri Lanka should actively pursue what are the possibilities of having regional interconnections, and India-Sri Lanka interconnection is a great example of that. What are the advantages of regional interconnections? As you do a lot more solar, which should definitely take out the diesel. I just had the only opportunity of going around Colombo yesterday evening, and I must confess, when I saw the diesel generating station in the heart of Colombo, I thought that's not probably the best thing for the country as a whole. That's 30 cents bleeding out the fiscal side, and obviously not very conducive for the climate as well. So if Sri Lanka would like to get out of very expensive diesel plants, a combination of solar, but solar is in the day, you have to look at storage. Storage has multiple options now being discussed. You can have pumped storage hydro, where you use a lot of solar in the day to actually pump the water up back and then use it in the nighttime. You can have some battery energy storage solutions, and you can do wind, because this country is also blessed with wind. But even after all of that, energy security requires regional interconnections, especially on markets that are very large. So if the diesel-based generation is as much as 20-25 cents, whereas the neighboring Indian electricity market has an average price of 7 to 8 US cents, it's a no-brainer for Sri Lanka to get connected, that at times of evening peak or any form of energy security, you can get the power and have regional energy trade. So that's a regional platform is very important. What we also did for some of the smaller island states, Sri Lanka is of course not SIDS, but Pacific Islands and all are coming together to do an aggregate procurement. Because the private sector doesn't want to do 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt plant in small islands. And why to replicate all those bids? So all the island countries are coming together, and they signed a declaration of intent to do an aggregate digital tender to get the economies of scale, the best private sector to come and get into solar and batteries packaged there. So that's another platform, SIDS platform and regional interconnection platforms.
Excellent. So just to follow up on that pillar, I think Sri Lanka has been in conversation on regional connectivity and connecting with the Indian grid during the crisis that, I mean, that became a main conversation to an extent because, okay, what are the options that we have? Uh, do you have, I saw also India has connected with, I think, the Nepalian grid, and there's a broader program going also, if I remember right, connecting also to the Middle Eastern grid. Could you share what's the response, since you have also done change management and and on the leadership on taking, convincing different stakeholders onto a common objective? How was the response on this grid connectivity? I'm not sure, because those countries have some level of land connectivity that they are more open, or whether as Sri Lankans we are in an island, so we are quite cautious when we try to connect, or what is the response when you try to connect the grids? What are the risks, or what are the common issues that is coming up? Since this is a conversation, as Advocata, we have been mainly also advocating for somewhat grid connectivity, and I have read a report, like a feasibility study, which was done, I think, in 1990s, or even I think it goes before that. But again, it was a feasibility study. Probably now, if you want to do the grid connectivity, probably there has to be another feasibility study to be done. Could you, give some context with your global expertise? How does it work, and what are the main concerns by the other regional players when this connectivity business comes into play?
Sure. Well, on your point in between, when I was in India leading the program, we were trying to do Sri Lanka interconnectivity 15, 20 years back as well. So
Okay.
I think it's been under discussion, but I believe the time has come. But I'll tell you why. We had a regional interconnection discussion in Colombo day before yesterday, where Bhutan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, UAE, and Indian stakeholders were together. And what came out is unequivocal support of what Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh mentioned has happened because of grid connectivity with India. Nepal has very little hydro in winters. So the interconnectivity with India is the way by which they get the power. Similarly is the case with Bhutan. And Bhutan sells a lot of hydropower exports, which are a large set of their national revenues. Hydro is like gold for them.
Yeah.
So each of these three countries are saving enormous amount of billions of dollars on either both diesel but also revenues by having the interconnectivity. And now you're talking about an undersea link of 40 to 120 kilometers.
Yeah.
There is a very advanced discussion with UAE and Saudi Arabia of actually having an undersea link of more than 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers. And both the countries, the UAE expert, who's the advisor to the minister, was asking to expedite this undersea link because there's a win-win for everyone. It can bring down the cost of battery storage because your peak is not the peak elsewhere. And therefore, the investment requirements for battery can be minimized considerably. And then there is a path for interconnecting South Asia to Asia through Singapore. So not only does Sri Lanka get access to the whole market by connecting to India, it brings down the cost of your energy and it gives you energy security. I think that is very important. So I think the business case for regional interconnections is there. The question sometimes is of looking at institutional mechanisms and financing, but once a business case is there, those issues can always be resolved.
Excellent. So you have explained three key pillars of the alliance, and of course we are waiting to see the country framework. So then probably we can go to the details. Anything else that we need? Yes, there's.
Yeah, the fourth pillar, just very briefly, is on technology policy and technology roadmaps. The world is changing very fast. You're thinking of new technologies like building integrated PV, by which the glass of any building and the material will be based on solar. So you need not even have solar PV. So land-constrained countries like Sri Lanka, where a lot of urbanization will happen, can have a lot of new technologies on building integrated PV solve the energy requirement. There is a technology called perovskite that is very different in terms of solar PV, not even doesn't use silica. And then on the batteries, there's a lot of experimentation that's going on, long-term battery storage. So countries want a view from us that which technologies should they bet on. Because once you bet on a technology, you're stuck for 25 years. So we want to do an analytical framework to help countries understand that in their context of green hydrogen, perovskites, BIPV, what is the policy, what we need to do to actually absorb. That I think is the fourth pillar.
Thank you very much. So, to understand the policy context and to basically untap this private sector capital on one side and also on the regional connectivity, what sort of a policy framework that you are looking at that respective country or your country partner, and what is the best practice that you have seen in other parts of the world?
Sure. So if you suggest, then we can come to now the country partnership framework. Out of 124 countries, we will prioritize at the most 7 or 8 countries to do a country partnership framework, and Sri Lanka is one of them.
That's good news for us.
What entails in a country partnership framework? Either the 4 pillars that we talked about, but then something that is very contextual to Sri Lanka would be analyzed, or what is a 3 to 5 year ecosystem framework for developing the entire ecosystem for solar batteries and EVs in Sri Lanka. And over next 3 to 4 months, we will have multiple sets of discussions with multiple stakeholders to finalize a country partnership strategy. And then we will set up a dedicated national support unit in Sri Lanka, because these things cannot be done sitting somewhere else. You need hands on the ground, ears on the ground, complex project management to get it implemented. Now, what are some of the ideas? I think the first idea is you have a very ambitious solar plan, the Green Acceleration Plan. What will it take to put in framework for its speedy implementation? There are concerns of private sector, there are concerns on land, there are concerns on others. We will like to hear from the government, private sector, regulators, all of us, including the multilateral agencies which are supporting you, what kind of a policy and regulatory framework will help speed this process. Like setting up a solar park. What is preventing solar parks? Are there real issues on land titles? So that I think is one pillar. The second pillar, as I mentioned, or the second theme of the country partnership framework is the Star C Center. Institutions take a long time, unfortunately, but we have to set the right foundations. If we are able to set the right foundations, help Sri Lanka create a good business plan, perhaps take an example of digital practices. One of the things which is coming out with countries that have done very good on solarization by private sector is on importance of digital tendering. Now it is possible to have digital tools of allowing all private sectors to digitally tender through an auction or a reverse auction process, get the least possible price, and a contract template that has clear accountability frameworks of things to be done at the right time. Finally, I believe solar now has the power of creating a lot of jobs for youth and women. Farmers, for example, can really look at solar technologies, whether it is a solar pump, because diesel is way too expensive. India has more than 2 million solar pumps now. India has dedicated schemes to help solar pumps, but also to avoid wastage of food. I believe in most countries, probably including Sri Lanka, a large amount of food, 20-30% is getting wasted. How to actually get cold storage solutions and others that are now possible with such an abundant sunshine in Sri Lanka. So we will evaluate some of that. And finally, yesterday, we had a great entrepreneur who was talking about solar ferries. Now, there are about ferries which need not have diesel-based, boats. So at least on a test case basis, if you can have solar, maybe charged with solar EVs as well. And finally, something that we are seeing in most developing countries, urban mobility is a lot about two-wheelers and three-wheelers. If switching it to battery, which is cheaper, but looking at battery swapping, battery technologies. So you see the gamut of how it can impact the lives of so many people, bring down the cost is enormous. So that is something that we are planning to study over the next 6 months and then have a country partnership strategy for next 3 to 5 years.
I want to quickly touch upon one point that you mentioned about the land. Now, one of the main, even the conversations that we had, different ministers, they tend to target on the rooftop solar because there are solar contracts being given. We have signed the agreement, and after some time, it is not connecting to the grid because the developer comes and says, look, I'm having a very difficult time getting the land cleared, because you have to go through multiple regulatory agencies. And in Sri Lanka's context, 80% of the land is owned by the government, and we pretty much have a program called BIMSAVIA, which actually gives the titles, but the process is very slow, which is, I mean, running for I think more than 10-15 years. But the process is very slow because we really haven't put a lot of resources on this, giving the digitized cadastral system,
I see.
and you really don't get a title in that context. But you also mentioned that if there's on under the second pillar, if I remember right, there are options, that there are penalties, there are incentives, and the government declares the
Correct.
land, and then you have some options. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this? Because from my little experience, it seems that land title seems to be, I mean, it will take a little bit of time on one side. At the same time, I want to also, on the same question, I'm not sure I'm making the question too loaded, but also the integrated framework that you would like to work, because it seems with solar, you have to look at other options as well. Like, is there an integrated approach where on storage and maybe with wind on the all the renewable aspect, or are you pretty much as an alliance only targeting the solar side in this context?
Sure.
Did I make it too complicated for
No,
you?
no, no. I think, but let me dissect, because you asked Dhanat multiple questions. On the details of land, I think I'm not the expert because I don't know the Sri Lankan context. The question of land related laws are very contextual to each country. So I am not in a position to give you a detailed answer on that. But I'll give you a generic perspective, both from an international experience, which is that the speedier process of land transfers and any compensation elements that are related to loss of income or anything by anyone, that is possible. Because there is policies and frameworks that can standardize the process for crop compensation and other elements that are there for transmission lines, for land. I think the issue is removing multiple parties involved, and then, of course, looking at the local land. You asked in the end another question, you have to remind me, which was about?
Which is the integrated way of, yes.
Now, we are Solar Alliance. We definitely do batteries, and we can talk about green hydrogen. But indeed, a lot of experience that's coming up in some countries is about hybridization. That can the combination of solar and wind and hydro give you a lot more clarity? I think it will happen much more so if you have a regional interconnection as well. That's the integrated ecosystem approach. Because what does Sri Lanka have? Sri Lanka has loads of sunshine, Sri Lanka has lots of water, and Sri Lanka has lots of wind. So what is the best optimal combination of utilizing all these three? Which I can assure you, what the world is seeing will need a huge amount of transmission investments. If you were to go to countries like Vietnam, India, and others that are doing a lot of renewable energy, they will tell you our top priorities are transmission and, of course, land. So I think solar eventually can be managed. What is important is a lot of transmission investments and concerns around availability of land. Now, this is something that we'll have to discuss. We will discuss with the government. We'll have to understand what the context, what other partners are already doing, our local think tanks, World Bank, ADB. But we will bring all the international experience to do something that's very action-oriented. One of the things that I believe is very important is not to have reports, but to have real milestones for actions over 6 months, 2 years, 3 years. That will be our intent.
I think even the Prime Minister, from what I saw on reported news stories, that she has given a very strong commitment that solar and renewable is no longer like an option. It's a mandatory thing that we need to do if we are serious about it. On that note, yes.
One small thing I will say, what I think the Honorable Prime Minister Harinama Surya was very clear. It should not be seen from a perspective of an international pledge only. I think what's driving solar, if you look at most countries, is the economics of it. I'll give you an example of Africa. We got 4 countries who are all diesel based at 25-30 cents, commit to the first competitive tender on an aggregation. And even countries Sierra Leone, Chad, Togo, and Liberia, with unfortunately a lot of fragility, got price bids of 4 cents with battery storage, with of course a lot of concessional IDA financing. I think what countries are now realizing is for them to get out of energy poverty, because energy is the essential artery of economic growth for digitization and others. What is your least cost option? And I think there, what the Prime Minister was suggesting is solar will play a very large role in your energy security.
Also, want to understand under International Solar Alliance, do you have any like compliance guidelines? For an example, is there has to be a particular percentage of your renewable, I mean, contribution to the national grid, or especially the generation companies, whether if let's say the entire generation is under one holding company where you have solar, wind, hydro, everything together, whether does it restrict investing on that company, because there's a component also which is coming from diesel, which is not your objective. We are mainly promoting the solar energy. I just want to understand, because some funds basically, like when a hedge fund invest in another country, you have like a compliance guideline. It has to be the country has to have a separate credit rating, so on and so forth. So are there any guidelines in that sort under the Solar Alliance?
So let me please answer that in two parts. One is that because we are a body which is not an investment body, we believe that countries first must have their own least cost generation plan,
Right.
which means Sri Lanka must decide what is likely demand scenario in next 5 to 10 years, and based on that, what are the least cost generation options for Sri Lanka. And I think it's very important not to be preachy about it, because that is Sri Lanka's context. I'm 100% confident that I haven't seen that, I must confess, because that's something that we'll do as part of our country partnership. But a large portion of solar, wind, and regional interconnection will form the basis because they are most economically viable. Now, once you have done that, then you have to plan your system, do your bidding, and others around it. Any international levels of how much solar or this are a point of what is called national determined contributions, which is a separate arrangement that is done under the UN COP arrangements, because the countries sometimes are asked to do what's your national determined contribution of what kind of carbon reduction footprint. So in both these elements, whether you do a least cost generation plan or an NDC, it is a country owned. We are not coming in with strictures. I think our value addition is what is best for you and why you're not able to do it, and to do it, how you're going to get private sector and different parties to come together. Because that, according to me, is the missing piece.
Understood. Before, I want to explore more on the change management side of it when we are getting into it. But before that, given since everyone also talks about the new tariff lines from the US, there's a supply chain that also is required for solar power to accelerate on the solar panels, and there's more equipment, and generally those equipment and entire technology also comes in a global value chain, which different countries taking I mean having an edge on different sectors to really bring the cost down. Because okay, solar is available free of charge, but you have to have the solar panels. For that you have to have a manufacturing, the cost has to come down if to make it really viable and feasible in moving forward. Do you see any risk given the supply chain dimensions of the other technology and the components, parts and components of it? And is your alliance also working on those guidelines to make it feasible and make the ecosystem stable?
It's a very interesting question, because some of the larger countries who are doing a very huge expansion, again, if I may look at neighboring India, 110 gigawatts done, another 150 gigawatts under plan for next 5 years. The question of energy security has become intertwined with industrial policy. What are we doing about manufacturing? Of course, India is now getting into almost 70, 80 gigawatts of manufacturing of modules and cells. But that's where, from an international solar alliance perspective, I go back to a fourth pillar of technology policy and technology roadmaps. I think the countries must understand where are they on relative comparative advantage if they want to set up manufacturing of certain issues. Because perhaps the answer for supply chain diversification, which is a national goal for a lot of countries, is not on doing everything themselves, but to actually look at what kind of partnerships and alliances are really needed to get into an alternate supply chain. So that is a question of national priorities. Our job is to give a lot of data analytics and understanding of what's happening on technologies. I will say this answer is extremely important even for urban mobility. If the urban mobility of two-wheelers and three-wheelers is going to explode in next 20, 30 years, each country will ask a question, should I be assembling some of that? Should I be completely import dependent on that? So I think these are important policy questions. We can help do the policy advice on what are the policy options for the country.
Now let's move on the change management side, because with the current energy mix, when you are moving to more solar and renewable energy, of course there's a automatic change management process that has to happen across many sectors, as energy consumers to as policy developers, as for generating companies and all the stakeholders. Can you share, because at the same time in the current setup there are also people who getting benefited at the current setup. That's how the economies works, and the transition, because of that, it's natural that you get the resistance from the people who are already quite familiar with the current process to change to a new system. Or in terms of policy changes, in terms of gearing up to this renewable phase with solar, how do you recommend or share a few best case studies that you have come across in your consultancy career and also working with the Solar Alliance? How do you think on this change management process, especially since you have a regional experience, since Sri Lanka and India is quite close, and pretty much sometimes the dynamics not exactly the same, but you get a sense of the cultural aspect also. How do you, what would be your thought process on this change management process?
One thing that I feel that not as a universal appeal on absorption of new technologies and the change management process of that is communication and digitization. More and more that the process of doing solarization batteries that can be digitized, made more transparent, open, disseminate, I think the absorption of that happens more and more. So I think one experience and that I have across all countries, again, look at countries that have done a very deep level. If they digitize the whole process, if they put everything on the web, everything is available, the absorption and credibility and trust goes higher. The second is communication. Communication has to be matched by economics. There's a clear reason why solar rooftops have gone such a high penetration in Sri Lanka. It's pure economics. Compared to the rising cost, people see in their own wallet, it makes sense. But in terms of how to actually effectively utilize solar rooftops, how to actually maintain it, how to make sure that they're optimizing with batteries, without batteries, is a lot of communication. Another part of that communication is digital learning. I feel, and this is actually a big intent, that it is very important to democratize knowledge. Today, if you and I buy any equipment and we don't understand how is it working, we go to YouTube and open how to actually operate this. That should happen with all new technologies like solar. There must be a very clear program. If A, B, or C problem is not happening, what needs to happen? A student in a high school, I believe, must have some panels on the rooftop to start exploring, because that's how the youth change. And that is my final element of the cultural change. What's universal across the world, incidentally, is the young people are much, much more passionate about climate change and new technologies. So we must empower them. we must give them a lot more forces, like I mentioned about school-related practical knowledge and others. And then in 5, 10 years, they will decide the change management. That is some of the best ways to do it.
Excellent. Also, wanted to understand, since you have worked in sub-Saharan Africa, also during the macroeconomic crisis in Egypt. In fact, we have engaged with people like Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia during that crisis period. Uh, how do you see the change taking place in a difficult context? Where, as we all know, we have, mounting debt repayments in 2028 in Sri Lanka. I'm not asking, I know you haven't studied Sri Lanka in particular because your assignment is on this case quite different. But pulling up some of the examples, what you did in Egypt, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in, I don't know, many number of countries, what would be your, broader framework, how people should look at it, think tanks like us, or how the government, the makers should approach this problem?
Um, I believe every crisis is an opportunity, because if you want new things and disruption to happen, when there's a crisis, it's a much bigger opportunity. I mean, if you look at India's 91 kind of reforms, a lot of it was also because of crisis. And look, we are having a huge benefit.
And you consider yourself a product after
Exactly.
1991
The
reform.
opportunities of private sector and others, that have continued, and last 10, 15 years, have continued to being even more and more strengthened. So I feel the starting point is that if you have a problem, and if you have a problem, for example, of very high level of public debt, the answers have to come of exciting private sector. That is the only way out. And then, like almost a very clear focus, what are the real problems for private sector not to invest? And there, the answers are sometimes process, policies, and a long-term vision and clarity. I will also say institutions play a very important role. Like, for example, again, I will take the example of India, setting up Solar Energy Corporation of India as an intermediary to take the risk, bundle the issues, and make sure the private investor don't have to deal with a lot of risk is a very interesting example. And countries like Sri Lanka must think that if you want to do a large-scale program of new technologies and others, what kind of institutional mechanisms are very important as well. So I would say that the other element of managing a crisis is on empowerment. Often people who can really make a change don't feel sufficiently empowered. And I've come to believe that while policy, regulations, and different elements are important, individuals make a lot of difference. But as I started off by saying that I saw in Egypt, for example, a country that unfortunately had not done any private sector investment for 15 years. Once they were able to do the difficult exchange rate reforms, they got new laws for renewable energy, gas law. They put in a new tax system. And then they had a contractual framework which was very clear on penalty structures and incentive structures. And yes, there were some processes. They started with a very high tariff, but that had to be brought down because it was too high. Eventually, they got world's largest solar park, 2,000 megawatt, in 18 months flat at a really substantial tariff. What's very important in that journey, like that of other countries like India, you may start with a slightly higher tariff on the first time because people are getting used to the regulatory environment, and then it keeps coming down as people become more comfortable. So that element of another journey for private sector engagement is very critical. Don't expect that in your first bid, you will match what UAE and India is doing. I saw that problem in Egypt, for example, where when they wanted to bring down a 14-cent tariff to 7, the cabinet was saying, why can't I get 2 like UAE? But you see, you're not UAE. And therefore, understanding the context, doing things step by step, eventually will get private sector comfort with the country.
Also wanted to explore, since you have, I mean, we are at the final stages of our conversation, but yet I wanted to also understand, since you mentioned about this particular example of, bringing the tariffs down, sometimes the bottleneck is on the grid or the transmission. I think the Sri Lanka, there is a conversation. I mean, at the moment where we are, is that the CEB asked to cut down the contribution through solar over the weekend because our grid really cannot absorb. So, is the alliance provide or even bringing down the risk down on also the other components of the electricity value chain? Is it a option? And also, I would like to also understand, after the country framework, what is like the next step,
Sure.
and what other institutions that we will see in Sri Lanka's point of view that would come up, and what benefits that we will get, or what can we to contribute back at the same time.
So, on your first question, as I was telling you, I think probably 2, 3 questions before, having a very good transmission system that can absorb the variable renewable energy and intermittency is the most important question. In fact, I was asked this question about a Spain and Portugal blackout also that happened 2 months back. And that was my response, which thankfully has been corroborated by the report that came out 2 weeks back, that it was a lack of reactive power and transmission which were responsible. So definitely the country will need to prioritize a very viable transmission plan backed by a lot of investments to take care. A lot of solar energy will have to be put together. What will be our role? We will assess this question, and of course, depending on government's view on if some study on variable renewable energy integration is really required. What would success look like? Very good question. I would say this is just a launch. Now we have to make a country partnership strategy. So 6 months down the line, when the country partnership strategy is ready, I'll be very happy to come back and talk about what are the specifics and details for Sri Lanka.
Excellent. My final question: you have started as a private consultant, or like working for a consultancy company, and then again have gone for higher studies, and you have taken a role at the World Bank, and now you are leading the International Solar Alliance. And you, at the beginning, you mentioned sometimes it's not all about, in a way, like money, that you have to take a pay cut and then you do what your heart says and then you move on. In a new world order, or with a lot of changes that is taking place, what would be the advice that you would give for the younger generation who have probably seen the multilaterals, the private sector working with the government, independent sort of regulatory agencies? When you think of a career, there are different phases. So what advice that you would give for someone who is looking as a career option or thinking on the same lines? Also, you had to earn money, you had to take care of your personal life on one side. At the same time, you also want to contribute for a larger cause than yourself. And it seems in your career that you have gone through multiple phases. So what advice that would you like to share?
Well, one principle that I think is the under rock of this is, when you wake up every morning, do you feel excited about what you have to do? I feel blessed, coming from such a humble background, to get into a position of trying to influence 124 countries and make this world a far better place. That's what drives me every day. Different things may drive different people, and therefore I have a very simple 3-step process for it. First of all, explore, but figure out what gives you happiness and what's the purpose of your life. Once you have figured out what's the purpose of your life, the question will be, what are you going to do about it? Because often we keep thinking that we want to do this, but we keep on ruminating. And the final question, which I think is a very important question, but very difficult one, what are you willing to give up? Once you can make decisions on all those three, world will take open doors for you. So most of the battle, therefore, is within you to figure out what you want to do, what are you going to do about it, and what you're willing to give up.
Ashish, thank you very much for joining Advocata Studios and providing this explanation. not only about the Solar Alliance, but also sharing some of your personal experiences, in a way, some life lessons and also some lessons on policy reforms. Thank you very much, and we
Thank
wish
you so
you
much.
all the very best. And we are looking forward to have another conversation when the country's strategy and the partnership framework is laid out. I think not only us, all Sri Lankans are excited, and I think this was an area even not much discussed in media. I think there are options that we can take the message across. So, looking very much forward for it, and wishing you all the very best on the very important work that you do.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really delighted to have joined you. Thank you, Dana.
Thank you very much for our audience for watching us. And as you know, you can subscribe us on Advocata Institute, which is our English channel. We are available in Sinhala under Advocata Plus and also in Tamil under Advocata Kural. Of course, you can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, in any social media platform. And we'll see you with another conversation next time.